There was a frustrating little Reader's Digest story out not too long ago about our prospering, wealthy friend, Mr. Bill Gates. I don't know what his personal net worth is now, but according to these calculations, if Bill Gates were to buy a $250,000 sports car, like a Lamborghini, it would be like you or me spending 67 cents. That's how much it would hurt. 67 cents. This same little math vignette suggested that if Mr. Gates were to see a $100 bill lying on the sidewalk, it literally would not be worth the 2 seconds it would take to bend over and pick it up. It'd be like straining your back to pick up a penny, or in Old England, a halfpenny. You just wouldn't bother. What's that got to do with this Bible parable where a very intense emphasis is placed on money and who got how much? We've already suggested that it's dangerous, maybe even fatal, to have the word deserve in the Christian vocabulary. I deserve such and such pay. I deserve a mansion in heaven. I deserve a high position in God's government, a seat right next to Jesus at the Last Supper. As a person stands in the shadow of the cross of Calvary, it's foolish to think that we deserve any kind of paycheck at all at the end of the day. Now here's Philip Yancey's take on this parable as quoted in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace. I'm going to quote, "We risk missing the story's point that God dispenses gifts, not wages. None of us gets paid according to merit, for none of us comes close to satisfying God's requirements for a perfect life. If paid on the basis of fairness, we would all end up in hell." One of my theme Bible verses screams it through a megaphone. "For it is by grace you have been saved," Lonnie, "through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." That's Ephesians 2, 8 and 9. So in one sense at least, if the words deserve and earn and paycheck come out of our vocabularies, then what is the point of this story? One thing we could learn for sure is that Jesus is telling us this. Lonnie, don't keep your eyes on your fellow workers. Don't look at what others are paid. Don't pay a lot of attention to how Bill Gates is being treated. Just focus on your own relationship with me. Because one thing is true in this story. Not one person was underpaid. No one was cheated. The owner did live up to every bargain. He fulfilled all promises. And people only got into trouble and into murmuring spirit when they began to look around to the pay stubs of their peers. There's a quiet little story at the end of the Gospels where none less than Jesus himself tells someone to just plain mind their own business. Christ has just had a bit of a loving confrontation with Peter, remember, who denied him before the crucifixion. And here in John chapter 21, Jesus very kindly tells his restored disciple Peter that one day he's going to die a martyr's death, just like Jesus, which is all right with Peter. He accepts that tough news. But just a moment later, he looks around and sees John standing nearby. And maybe instinctively he asks Jesus, what will happen to him? And Jesus tells him this, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. In other words, that wasn't something Peter needed to know. How God was going to treat John wasn't a concern for Peter. The bottom line for Peter was that Christ was going to sustain him, see him through, empower his ministry, be with him when he picked up his own cross, and finally guarantee him a home in heaven. That was the package for Peter, and that's all Peter needed to know. Several years ago, when Jeannie and I were living in Southern California, there was a lot of huffing and puffing there in Los Angeles at the start of the baseball season about the salaries of baseball players. And in response to that, the Los Angeles Times printed out the annual pay package for every player on all 30 major league clubs who was getting more than $1 million a year, which is just about everyone, it seems. But it's interesting that on any one team, there will be a Mr. Big, a superstar, who's getting 8 or 10 or $20 million. Then a couple who get 5, 1 or 2 maybe get 2.3 million, and then several players who just get only 1 million. Maybe the bat boy gets $1 million. Well, I'm kidding. But there are also players on that same team who only get maybe $200,000. And they're on the same team, playing on the same field as a guy who's getting $50 million for playing the same game. And especially on a night where the superstar trillionaire makes 2 errors and strikes out 5 times, there could be some rumbling in the clubhouse afterwards. Why is this man making so much more than I am? This is unfair. I want to renegotiate my salary. I'm embarrassed to even look back at those days now compared with today, especially in terms of this very parable about the salaries and the hurt feelings, and then applying them to a ball team which goes on to win the World Series. But here's a point for Christians to consider. The fact is, the harvest came in. The overriding goal was reached. The championship was won. And if some workers made more than others or had better batting averages, so what? Don't worry so much about what's happening in the lives of others, Jesus says. You keep your bargain with me and things will be all right for you. You may make a little more or a little less than others in this life. Perhaps you'll be famous. Perhaps not. But if you labor in my vineyard, eternal life will be yours. And we have as an example the experience of Peter. How long did this wild and woolly disciple serve Jesus? His whole adult life, with beatings and trials and nights in jail and persecutions, and then a crucifixion at the end. How long did the thief on the cross serve Jesus? A few minutes? Maybe an hour or so? What reward did they both receive? An eternal life in God's kingdom, living in mansions with the identical floor plans. Is that okay with the thief? Sure. Is it okay with Peter? I'm sure he'll be happy with that arrangement as well. Here's the bottom line. Whether you live in relationship with Jesus Christ and serve Him for one day or for 95 years in the mission field, the reward is the same. You get an eternity, not 100 years, not 1,000, not 1,000,000, billion, or trillion, but an eternity of a life greater and richer and more abundant than you can imagine. We'd never try to describe it for our listeners on the radio because we'd be idiots if we thought we could do it. But you and I and that thief on the cross and the mass murderer on death row who has a deathbed conversion are all going to get that same paycheck. We're all going to get mansions and we're going to live in them for a very, very, very long time. With that in mind, does the concept of a little bit more pay or a little bit less pay or a slight discrepancy in the scale down here for these few years on this little planet really matter? No, it doesn't matter. This isn't the real game down here. Down here is nothing. And Jesus tells us this parable to remind us to keep our eyes on the real prize. If we get hung up comparing things down here, figuring out who deserves what, when that word shouldn't even be in the lexicon, then we've missed the boat. For the mathematicians among us, we could well think of that sideways 8, which indicates infinity. When your prize is infinity, you can't get more than that. You can't add to infinity. It would be like giving Bill Gates $1 or him getting upset if you didn't give him $1. People who have as many billions as he does in the bank really do not worry about the dollar or about the paycheck for 1 hour or even one long day in the vineyard. Their eyes are on much bigger prizes than that.